When people talk about clones in gaming, it's usually about the Getaway, Driver, Watch Dogs, and True Crimes, which are all seen as Grand Theft Auto clones. But there's another gaming franchise that also ended up having a lot of clones as well. Gran Turismo, released in 1997 on the original PlayStation, pretty much changed racing games forever. Here you had a game that allowed you to choose a car and track, and also allowed you to unlock cars, but it was all wrapped up nicely into a career mode where you buy your way into some of the fastest cars that Japan had to offer at the time. What followed for the next few years was the release of a few games that tried to beat Polyphony Digital and Sony Computer Entertainment at their own game. No pun intended. The Sega Dreamcast and the original Xbox had games such as Sega GT, Sega GT 2002, and Forza Motorsport. There were even one or two spin-offs of arcade franchises like R Racing Evolution, released in 2003, which was a spin-off of the Ridge Racer games. Not only was it released on the Xbox and GameCube, but also the PlayStation 2. Namco was lucky that Gran Turismo 4 was delayed by over a year, as that would have taken a lot of R Racing Evolution's sales. But there was another so-called Gran Turismo clone in the works as well. Konami, who in terms of racing games didn't have much success, wanted a slice of the Gran Turismo pie, and released their own interpretation of it. Enthusia Professional Racing was intended to be what Gran Turismo, R Racing Evolution, Forza Motorsport, and Sega GT were, but mixed with a different style of career mode and progression. Enthusia Professional Racing was released on the PlayStation 2 in March 2005 in Japan, and the rest of the world in May the same year. Other than giving it one of the worst names that a racing game has ever had, this was their first mistake. Releasing a game that at first glance looks like just another Gran Turismo clone on the PlayStation 2 soon after the release of the much anticipated Gran Turismo 4 was not the best move. But when you get into the game, you'll realise that it's nothing like Gran Turismo or any of its clones. And the game's introduction definitely shows that. It starts with the quote, "If you believe you can, therefore you can," by Anonymous. I don't think it's actually anonymous, but the person who said it probably wanted to stay anonymous, as it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. That is then followed by a bunch of shots that have nothing to do with each other or racing. It does become a little bit more normal with a racing montage, but there are shots of a woman with a camera every now and then, which is seen crying at the end after a crash. The introduction gives me the impression that what the game is, as we know it, isn't what the developers initially intended, as it implies that there's a story with characters, neither of which the game has. My guess is that the main character would have been the woman with the camera, who starts racing as a tribute to what I assume her late father who died in the crash. Sort of like the story to Toko Race Driver, which is one of the worst storylines in the racing genre. But what is Enthusia Professional Racing like? The main part of the game is called Enthusia Life, and it has so many different aspects to it, I have had a lot of issues trying to write this part of the review script. So to make sure that I cover everything, I am going to break things down even more than I usually do. And although information may be all over the place, it is all there. But I have tried to structure it in such a way where it's easy to follow. You begin Enthusia Life at rank 1000, and as you win races and earn points, you will slowly make your way to rank 1. And during your progression to being the best driver, you will unlock more groups of racers. Finally, you end up in RS, which has the hardest and longest races in the game. But in order to get there, you need to start from the beginning. The game doesn't have a currency system, so to start this game mode, you have a few slow cars that are already unlocked. Mainly classic cars, hatchbacks, and the Toyota Estima Hybrid, which is the car that I decided to use just because of how weird it is, and because it's weird to have in a racing game. Once you've selected your car, you are able to get into the races, as there are no license tests, which is something that was implemented into Gran Turismo and Sega GT. The races themselves are actually quite interesting. First of all, your car's odds of winning determines where it is on the starting grid. So if it has really good odds of winning, then it will start further back than a car that doesn't have a chance, which is the opposite to how it's done in real life, as the faster drivers in qualifying start at the front of the grid. This at times can make races quite easy on narrow tracks, as the slower cars can block the faster ones from overtaking, meaning that whilst they're all fighting for higher positions and not really going anywhere fast, you win. But that doesn't happen that often. Your car's odds of winning also determines how quickly you get through the game, as the slower your car is, the more points you get. But there is another point system in this game as well. This point system is called Enfu. The Enfu points will decrease every time you go off the track, hit a wall, or hit the AI, but the game will also take points away if the AI hit you, which isn't fair. I suppose it would have been impossible to make a system like that fair in 2005, as the game would have had to figure out who was actually at fault, and then make a decision instantly, which the PlayStation 2 would not have been able to do. The more your Enfu points decrease, the less likely you'll regain all of them at the end of the race, which means you have to drive even more carefully in the next race. Getting all of your Enfu points back at the end of a race gets easier in the later parts of the game as the maximum increases every now and then. I like the Enfu point system as you can't crash into other cars to get ahead. Well, you can, but you will pay for it. I think something like this needs to be added to modern racing games, because it adds a lot to the racing and it will put a lot of those Forza Motorsport Online players in line. Progression in the Enthusia Life game mode isn't that good, or it's brilliant. It all depends on what cars you win and when you use them. Enthusia Life is structured in such a way where you can't go into it with a plan and expect to have the same outcome as your last playthrough, as the prize cars that you get are all RNG dependent. Although you can get quite far with whatever car you selected at the beginning, it will get to a point where you'll need a much faster car from the R2 races onwards. Then, you might not have won a car that is fast enough to beat the opponents. You can also use a car that is too fast, to a point where the game won't give you enough points to progress, as unlike Gran Turismo 4, the points you get at the end of a race actually mean something. This means you will need a mix of approaches to your progression. The way I went about it was I got through some of the game to a point where I knew certain events would appear. Then I could race against the cars that I wanted and just continue to do that until I had enough good cars for the rest of the game. This didn't always work out though, and a lot of time was wasted trying to get a specific car. But I was in a unique spot as I needed certain cars for this video, which is something that you wouldn't need in a normal playthrough. I really like the way the career mode is structured, as it makes you think a little bit more about what your next move is going to be. And although you can lose a lot of progression just by prize car hunting, once you've got those cars, it is very easy to get back to where you were. Although I prefer the career modes in games such as Gran Turismo 4 and Forza Motorsport, I like the idea of Enthusia Life, but I can see why something like this hasn't been added to a racing game since. I don't think it can be picked up and played by anyone, which I believe is one of the main reasons to why the game only has an average score of 70 out of 100 from critics and 75 out of 100 from players on Metacritic. My only issue with the Enthusia Life game mode is that the developers overcomplicated every aspect of it, and that probably put a lot of people off the game entirely. But Enthusia Life isn't the only mode that the game has to offer, as you've also got Driving Revolution. In Driving Revolution, you have to drive through gates at a certain speed. It's not about how fast you drive the car, it's about how well you maintain the speed. If you're driving too fast, then the gates ahead will indicate that you're driving too fast, and if you're driving too slowly, then they'll indicate that you're driving too slowly. And so you obviously need to adjust your speed accordingly. You don't have to drive through the middle of the gate, but you do need to touch it as you drive through it. When you've finished one of the Driving Revolution challenges, the game will grade you on the accuracy of your speed and how many gates you've missed. I'm not sure how I feel about this game mode, as it kind of reminds me of the Gran Turismo license tests, which I wasn't really a fan of in the first place. And Driving Revolution doesn't give you anything of much worth. Having it as its own standalone game mode, I think, was a mistake. Driving Revolution should have been tied to the car unlocking aspect of Enthusia Life, so the game chooses a car for you to win or unlock, but then makes you do a Driving Revolution challenge in that car, and getting to keep that car depends on you passing the challenge. Just like Metropolis Street Racer on the Sega Dreamcast. I think that would have been a much better way of doing it. One of the things that sets Enthusia Professional Racing apart from all of the other Gran Turismo clones of the early to mid 2000s was its physics. Enthusia has got some of the weirdest physics that I have ever seen in any so-called realistic racing game. I've been trying to figure out a way to describe the physics, but I think Mark from Classic Game Room said it best when he said, "There's not a lot of road feel," which might seem weird to say about a video game, but I somehow 100% agree with him. Overall, the physics are just a bit too strange. It kind of feels like the developers were trying to make it as realistic as possible, but at the same time it feels quite arcadey, and not in a simcade kind of way. In terms of graphics, I think this game looks amazing, and that seems to be the general consensus. But there's no widescreen option. The lack of an in-game widescreen option from release is a shame, as the game probably would have benefited massively from it, but at least it doesn't affect how the environments look. Enthusia Professional Racing only has 14 track layouts, but they are diverse. The game has tracks set in cities all over the world, including London, Paris, and San Francisco, but the developers also made tracks from scratch, such as Cosmic Winding, Dragon Range, and Autumn Hill. There are also a few off-road tracks set in the desert, a cave, and a motocross track. I really like the track selection, and even though Enthusia doesn't have as many tracks as Gran Turismo 4 or even Forza Motorsport, the diversity of the tracks make up for it. I can't think of another game in the 6th console generation that allows you to race on a night version of Tsukuba, which is only one of 2 real-world tracks, the other being the Nürburgring. I think Enthusia is probably the best you can get on the PlayStation 2 in terms of the way the tracks look as well. Not just in terms of graphics, but also in how unique some of them are. Let's use the Nürburgring as an example. Yes, it is in a lot of games, but Enthusia seems to be the only game to set the Nürburgring in the morning, whilst most other games set the track at about midday. It is something small, but it does make a big difference. And it's the same with the cars as well. Enthusia Professional Racing has 211 cars. It may not have as many cars as games that it was competing with at the time, being 20 down on the car list in Forza Motorsport and being only 29.2% the size of the car list in Gran Turismo 4, but the car list only contains one of each model, with 1 or 2 exceptions. Unlike most games, the car list doesn't really have a bias towards one corner of the planet. All of the countries that had a large motor industry in 2005 get represented almost equally. But just like all of the other so-called Gran Turismo clones and also Gran Turismo itself, it's not just all supercars. Enthusia Professional Racing has one of the most diverse car lists that I have ever seen in a racing game. You do get sports cars, supercars and Grand Tourers, such as the Nissan Skyline GTR, Honda NSX, and Aston Martin Vanquish. Those cars you see in almost every racing game that has licensed cars, but Enthusia also has the EB110, which was called a Dower EB110. A car that was made out of Bugatti EB110 spare parts after the short-lived Bugatti Automobili went bankrupt in 1995. Dower was probably used because getting the license for any Bugatti at the time would have cost a lot because of the then brand new Veyron, which everyone was talking about. An odd choice of car type for a racing game such as Enthusia Professional Racing are MPVs and minivans, like the Nissan Elgrand, Toyota Alphard, Toyota Estima Hybrid, Honda Odyssey, Renault Aventime, and the Chevrolet Astro. The game also has quite a few SUVs, and Enthusia is the only game of its type where it makes sense to have SUVs, as you've got the desert. The game has the Range Rover L322, Mercedes G-Class, Volkswagen Touareg, Toyota Land Cruiser, and the Mitsubishi Pajero. And just like every other car in the game, they are a welcome addition. Over time, Enthusia Professional Racing has become one of my favourite PlayStation 2 games, and although it is seen as a Gran Turismo clone and always has been, it is much more than that. It seems that if a racing game was somewhat realistic, had a large car list, and a somewhat lengthy career mode, then it automatically gets branded as a Gran Turismo clone. But Enthusia isn't about going from race to race with whatever car you have. You have to properly think about how you're going to do not just the next race, but also the next few races after, which is something that you didn't really need to do with Gran Turismo, Forza Motorsport, Sega GT, or R-Racing Evolution. And so in a lot of ways, it is better than those games. It's a shame that Enthusia Professional Racing didn't get a second looking by almost everyone when it was released in 2005. The result of the poor sales figures means that it is relatively rare, and if you were to buy it in the UK now, it will cost you between £12 to £28, depending on what drugs the CX pricing department have been taking that day. But if you do have a spare £30 odd to spend on a 20-year-old racing game, then I do highly recommend buying this underrated gem. This has been my review of Enthusia Professional Racing for the PlayStation 2. This is one of the few games where I've had to write the review script around the gameplay footage. Normally I would play the game, write the review, and then get extra footage after. But with Enthusia, I had to get almost all of the footage that I intended on using before writing the script. Otherwise, I would have ended up losing a lot of progress if I needed footage of a car that needed unlocking. So I ended up playing through the game 3 times to make sure that I have footage of the cars that I mentioned, which was a bit annoying. Also, I probably should have re-reviewed Gran Turismo 3 before, just so I could give more context, but I'm not doing that anytime soon. What I am going to be doing next is a review of Forza Motorsport 6, but for now, it is time to end. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.